when a story uses brutal, on-page violence and really intense power imbalance romance tropes.
Right.
And it does that specifically to critique a cruel, authoritarian system. Here's the question. Do those extreme tropes end up undermining the critique?
Or do they actually sharpen the message, make it hit harder for the reader?
Exactly. It's a fine line to walk.
A very fine line.
Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. More than just a summary, which we do include, this feature examines how the author shapes argument, builds influence, and earns or loses your trust.
It gives you the tools to read with sharper insight and, I think, greater discernment.
Should you read this book? This should help. It's also excellent for aspiring writers.
Absolutely.
And if you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback really does help guide our future content.
So today we're diving into Direbound. This is book number 1 in the Wolves of Ruin series, written under the collaborative pen name Sable Sorensen.
And you really can't talk about this book without placing it firmly in that massive 2020s dark romantasy boom.
Not at all. It feels like it's in direct conversation with books like Fourth Wing, or even something with deeper political commentary, like The Hunger Games.
And for everyone listening, you're experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
So let's get into that structure. The book uses a template that fans of the genre will spot a mile away.
They will. It's almost a comfort in a way.
It is. The authors signal their genre fluency right from the start. The core recipe is classic, deadly trials,
Sure.
plus a bonded creature,
A direwolf in this case.
and of course that intense enemies-to-lovers dynamic. By handling these elements so confidently, they establish their credibility, their ethos. They're telling the reader, we know the ride you came for.
Okay, so let's set the stage. Our protagonist is Maren Cooper.
And this is important. She's not a long-lost princess or a hidden noble.
No, she's a commoner. The world is split, almost literally, with the rich, bonded elites living in luxury up above, while the poor live below.
And Maren's driving force, the logical core of the plot, is just brutally simple.
Her sister, Selah, has been kidnapped.
And the only way for Maren to cross enemy lines to find her is to enlist in the bonded system herself, to subject herself to these lethal trials.
Which immediately throws her into this, well, this hyper-violent military academy.
Exactly, and that's where she gets entangled with her instructor, Stark Therian.
He's the source of that central, very fraught romantic dynamic.
Like, all while she's just trying not to get killed in the trials themselves.
So there's a dual purpose here, isn't there? A dual exigence for the book.
I think so. Commercially, it's tapping right into that huge reader demand for high-stakes competition and these dangerous non-human bonds.
But thematically.
Thematically, the authors are using that framework to deliver something much bloodier, much grimmer. They're using the genre tropes as a vehicle to really interrogate class inequality and state-sanctioned violence.
And that takes us straight to the heart of the analysis, pathos, the emotional appeal.
It's the dominant appeal here, by far.
Because if you want to critique a cruel system, you can't just tell us it's cruel.
You have to make the reader feel it. The entire book seems designed to keep you in a state of sustained emotional stress.
And Maren's life is just a stack of unrelenting burdens.
It's relentless. It's not just the trials. It's being the sole caretaker for her mentally ill mother. It's her sister being gone. And the fact that her only real skill is fighting for cash in back-alley bouts out of sheer necessity.
That brings this working-class lens right to the foreground, which feels like a very specific rhetorical choice.
It is. She isn't fighting to reclaim a throne. She's fighting for money, for survival.
So her anger at the bonded elites isn't some abstract political position.
No, it's visceral. It's the resentment of someone from the bottom looking at the casual privilege of the top. We see the system through the grime and bruises, not through the eyes of a frustrated royal.
And the authors really lean into that, visualizing the class gap through physical hardship.
Oh, absolutely. The trials aren't just games. They're exercises in starvation, in humiliation. It's a constant reminder of what it costs to even try to enter the elite's world.
And that characterization seems to be the justification for the level of violence in the book.
It is, and we need to talk about that violence because it is extreme, on-page, and graphic.
So let's push on that. It's a huge rhetorical gamble. We're talking torture, characters dying while calling for their mothers.
Yeah.
What is the argument for including that?
The argument is that it's experiential rhetoric. The violence is there to completely erase any distance between you, the reader, and the suffering.
So it's not just shock value.
The intent, I believe, is to make you feel the inhumanity of the system so intensely that the critique becomes undeniable. If the violence is repulsive and personal, so is the system that allows it.
But here's the risk, isn't it?
Mm.
By making the violence that graphic, do you accidentally betray the critique?
How so?
Do we stop seeing the systemic cruelty and just get caught up in the gore? If your immediate reaction is just revulsion, you might shut down that rational political part of your brain entirely.
And that is the pitfall. For some readers, it works. The intensity cements the critique, but for others, it just feels gratuitous, and the political message becomes background noise for blood-soaked angst.
So the book demands that you actively read past the adrenaline to see the framework.
A very difficult task when the pathos is turned up that high.
Okay, so if the feeling is that intense, does the story's structure, its logos, actually support that weight?
Structurally, it's very coherent, which is probably necessary. The plot follows a clear chain. Kidnapping leads to enlistment, enlistment to trials, trials to intrigue.
It has a solid spine.
A very logical spine, which keeps the narrative from collapsing under its own chaotic events.
But the sources we looked at note that this coherence might come at the cost of predictability.
That's the trade-off, precisely. Reviewers point out that the story beats, especially in the trials, feel very familiar. The authors are leaning on established tropes to deliver that coherence.
A safe bet for a series opener, but maybe not super innovative.
Right. It's less about surprising you with the argument and more about satisfying the plot trajectory you expect.
That predictability might be necessary, though, given the complexity of the other relationships.
Like the human-wolf bond.
Exactly. Marin's bond with her dire wolf is just as central as her dynamic with Stark, and it's portrayed as brutal and pack-like.
And what's fascinating there is the use of silence.
Silence as a tension device.
Yes. Her direwolf initially refuses to communicate. It won't speak to her, won't acknowledge the bond. That absence of dialogue becomes this incredibly powerful, slow-burn rhetorical tool.
How does that build tension?
Because the direwolf is her key to survival. The silence forces Marin and the reader to focus entirely on physical cues, on nonverbal pack dynamics.
So every small breakthrough feels huge.
Exponentially powerful. It creates this strange, hard-won intimacy through deprivation.
We'll pause here for a brief reminder. You can find deep dives like this, along with other insightful book analysis, summaries, and critiques, on our YouTube channel, Mindful Moments. We aim to inspire reflection and rational thought in all the content we create. Now let's turn to what might be the most debated element here: the power asymmetry between Marin and her instructor, Stark-Therian.
This is central to the book's whole ethical framework.
That enemies to lovers arc is designed for maximum angst.
It is. It's built on a foundation of harsh training, public humiliation, mutual hostility, and the core analytical problem is Stark's overwhelming institutional power.
He's not just her enemy. He's her instructor, her superior.
In a system where failure means death, he literally controls her ability to survive.
And that's where the ethical tangle of consent and coercion really comes in. How do the authors handle that imbalance?
Well, they lean heavily on the reader's tolerance for the conventions of dark romance.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning, the subgenre often uses these power dynamics instructor-student, master-servant as a kind of shortcut to extreme tension. The bet is that the reader will accept the premise that Stark's cruelty is a twisted form of helping her survive.
Or that his hostility is just a mask for some deeper protective instinct.
Exactly. The control is framed as a function of survival. And when they do shift toward mutual attraction, does the book ever really dismantle that power structure?
Not in book one, it seems.
Not at all. The intensity is sustained because that power imbalance remains. His actions constantly blur the line between training and torment. The book suggests the passion is heightened because the relationship is institutionally forbidden.
So it's using a morally gray dynamic to generate extreme pathos.
And hoping the reader interprets it as intense attraction rather than ethical violation.
So tying this all together, what does this mean for the book's effectiveness as a political commentary?
Well, looking at the big picture, the book is incredibly effective at dramatizing how authoritarian systems weaponize things like loyalty, family, and trauma.
Especially against the poor.
Yes. Marin's class resentment and her sacrifice for her sister are powerful thematic drivers, no question.
But the critical takeaway for the reader has to circle back to that first gamble we talked about.
The violence and coercion.
Yes. Sorensen's heavy reliance on graphic harm and coercive dynamics risks normalizing the very behaviors they seem to be critiquing.
If the reader is just there for the adrenaline and the angst, the political message about systemic cruelty could easily get lost.
So discernment is key.
It's paramount. You have to read the text against its own genre habits to really get the argument it's making about freedom and equality.
And Marin herself. She's impulsive, she makes mistakes, which some reviewers say weakens our trust in her judgment.
Especially with her political choices.
Which leaves us with a final provocative question. Given the sheer weight of her trauma, can an unreliable narrator like her successfully sustain a powerful political critique against a ruling class?
Or does her personal anguish and erratic judgment just end up overshadowing the larger message of the book?
That's something for you to mull over as you consider diving into Direbound. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary, subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.